That night, my son-in-law leaned in close enough I could smell the whiskey on his breath, and said, real low, "Stay quiet. This ends tonight." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even flinch. I just nodded, turned around, and set the table like he'd asked. Because sometimes, the smartest thing a man can do when he's being threatened isn't to fight back right away. It's to let the other guy think he's already won. I folded the napkins. I lit the candles. And I waited. See, what he didn't know, what nobody at that table knew yet, was that silence isn't the same as surrender. And by the time dessert was served, everyone in that room would finally understand the difference. That dinner wasn't just a meal. It was the last time anyone in my family would ever tell me to stay quiet again. If you've ever been told to stay quiet just to keep the peace, if you've ever swallowed words that burned your throat because speaking up might cost you everything, then you already know exactly how I felt that night. I'm talking about the kind of silence that eats at you from the inside. The kind where you smile at the dinner table while your heart's pounding with rage and shame. Maybe you've been there too. Dismissed by your own family. Treated like you're the problem when all you ever did was love them and try to help. This isn't just my story. It's the story of every parent who gave everything and got nothing but disrespect in return. Every person who was told their feelings didn't matter as long as everyone else stayed comfortable. Family betrayal cuts deeper than any stranger ever could, because it comes from the people who were supposed to protect you. So stay with me until the end of this, because what happened next changed everything. And if you've ever felt invisible in your own home, you're gonna want to hear how I made sure I was finally seen. And hey, if this story hits home, go ahead and subscribe to my channel using the button below, because there's a lot more where this came from. My name's Robert Mitchell, but most folks who knew me back in the day just called me Bob. I'm 68 years old now, and I spent 43 years working as a structural engineer right here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, steel town, blue-collar roots, the kind of place where you earn respect with your hands, not your mouth. I started fresh out of Carnegie Mellon back in 1979, 22 years old and hungry to prove myself, and I worked on some of the biggest projects this city ever saw. The Fort Pitt Bridge renovation, the expansion at UPMC Presbyterian Hospital, even part of the new terminal at Pittsburgh International Airport. I wasn't the guy in the fancy office. I was boots on the ground, hard hat on, making sure buildings didn't fall down on people's heads. I missed my daughter's dance recitals, my son's baseball games, anniversaries and birthdays, all because I was out there making sure families had safe places to live and work. When you build something your whole life, people forget you were the one who laid the foundation. They just see the finished product and assume it was always there. I'm 68 now, and about 4 years ago, my wife Helen passed away. Pancreatic cancer took her in 6 brutal months, and I was right there holding her hand every single day until the end. We'd been married 41 years, high school sweethearts from Bloomfield, and when she was gone, our house on Walnut Street in Shadyside felt like a tomb. My daughter Sarah, she's 36 now, married, 2 kids. She came by one afternoon about 3 months after the funeral and suggested I move in with her and her husband Derek out in their place in Fox Chapel. At first I said no way, told her I didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to lose my independence, but she insisted, said they had plenty of space and it'd be good for everyone, especially the grandkids. So I sold the house Helen and I had lived in for 30 years, the one where I'd built the back porch with my own hands, and I moved into their finished basement. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I figured things out. That's what Sarah said. That was 4 years ago, and I'm still in that basement. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I don't pull my weight, because I do. More than anyone in that house wants to admit. I pay them $900 a month in rent, which is almost insulting when you consider I also cover about half the groceries every week at the Giant Eagle. I fixed their furnace last winter when it went out, and I watch my grandkids, Emma's 9 and Jake's 6, every single time Sarah and Derek want a date night or a weekend away. Last summer, I rebuilt their entire back deck when I noticed the support beams were rotting through. Spent 2 weeks in the August heat cutting and nailing and staining, and Derek didn't even say thank you. He just complained that I used the wrong color stain. I rewired half the kitchen outlets when they started sparking, patched the roof after that storm in March, and I still mow the lawn every Saturday morning at 7 a.m. because nobody else will. But here's the thing about family betrayal. It doesn't always announce itself with shouting and slammed doors. Sometimes it's just the little ways they make you feel like you're taking up space, like you're a problem they're too polite to mention out loud. Derek's 39, works in medical device sales for some company in Cranberry Township, and from the very first day I moved in, he's made it crystal clear he thinks I'm dead weight. He's one of those guys who talks loud at parties, laughs even louder, wears expensive watches he can't afford, and mistakes confidence for actual competence. He'll tell anyone who'll listen about his big deals and his sales numbers. But I've seen the credit card bills stacked on the kitchen counter when I'm making coffee in the morning. They're drowning in debt, leasing a BMW and a Range Rover they can't afford, taking trips to Cancun and Miami on borrowed money. I tried talking to Sarah about it once. Real gentle. Just mentioned I'd noticed they seemed stretched thin. But she looked at me like I'd insulted her and said, "Dad, Derek knows what he's doing. He's really good with money." And I just nodded and walked away. Because when you're living under someone else's roof, even when that someone is your own daughter, you learn real fast that your opinion doesn't count for much anymore. I spent 4 decades making sure structures could handle the weight they were designed to carry, calculating loads, checking stress points, reinforcing weak foundations before they turned into disasters. You don't just throw up a beam and hope it holds. You measure twice, you plan ahead, you think 3 steps down the line. That's how you keep people safe. That's how you make sure nothing collapses. But watching my daughter's marriage, watching the way Derek spent money like it grew on trees, watching him make decision after reckless decision, I could see the cracks forming clear as day. I could see the weight piling up in all the wrong places, the foundation starting to shift. And I knew, the same way I knew on every job site I ever worked, that if somebody didn't step in and reinforce things soon, the whole damn structure was going to come crashing down. But when you're the old man in the basement, the one everyone's gotten used to ignoring, nobody listens when you point out the cracks. They just smile, pat you on the shoulder, and tell you not to worry so much. They treat you like you're confused, like you don't understand how the modern world works, like your 43 years of keeping buildings standing doesn't mean a thing anymore. And maybe that's the cruelest part of these revenge stories. It's not strangers who make you feel small and useless. It's the people you raised, the ones you sacrificed your whole life for, the ones who should know better than anyone what you're capable of. So I stopped offering advice. I stopped trying to warn them. I just watched, and I waited, and I started paying real close attention to things I should have been watching all along. Derek wasn't always this bad, or maybe he was, and I just didn't see it clearly until I was living under the same roof. In the beginning, back when he and Sarah first started dating about 12 years ago, he seemed decent enough, polite, ambitious, always talking about his big plans and his career goals. But over the years, especially after they got married and had the kids, something shifted. Or maybe the mask just slipped. He started talking to Sarah differently, shorter, sharper, like she was an employee who kept messing up instead of his wife. And the way he talked about money, about his money, even though Sarah worked full-time as a nurse at Allegheny General, always rubbed me the wrong way. But I kept my mouth shut, figured it wasn't my place. Figured every marriage has its rough patches, and they'd work it out. But then I moved in, and I saw things I couldn't unsee. I heard the way he'd snap at Sarah when dinner wasn't ready on time, saw the way he'd roll his eyes when she tried to talk about her day, watched him spend $300 on golf clubs while telling her they couldn't afford to fix the washing machine. He treated my grandkids like accessories, showed up to Jake's soccer games just long enough to take a photo for Instagram, then spent the rest of the time on his phone closing deals. And the way he treated me, like I was some charity case he was doing a favor for, like I should be grateful he'd allowed me to live there and pay rent and fix everything that broke. One night in late September, I was upstairs fixing the garbage disposal again, and I heard him tell Sarah, loud enough for me to hear, "I'm tired of having your dad here, babe. He's always in the way." That's when I knew this wasn't just tension. This was family betrayal, plain and simple. The real breaking point came on a Friday night in early October, it was about 6 months ago now. Sarah had asked me to watch the kids, so she and Derek could go to some work event of his, some fancy dinner at the Omni William Penn downtown. I said sure, no problem. Made the kids mac and cheese, helped Emma with her homework, put them to bed by 8:30. Sarah and Derek got home around 11, and I could tell right away Derek had been drinking. His eyes were glassy, his words were slurring just a bit, and he had that mean edge in his voice that alcohol always brought out. Sarah looked tired, uncomfortable, and she went straight upstairs to check on the kids. That left me and Derek alone in the kitchen, and I was just rinsing out my coffee mug, getting ready to head downstairs, when he started in on me. "You know, Bob," he said, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, "you've been here a long time now. When exactly are you planning on getting your own place?" I turned around, kept my voice calm, and said, "Well, Derek, I pay rent. I help out around here, and Sarah said I could stay as long as I needed. So I guess until I find something that makes sense." He laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was cold, mocking. "Yeah, well, maybe it's time you start making it make sense, old man. This isn't a nursing home." I felt my jaw tighten, felt that old anger rising up, but I kept it down, kept my voice level. "I'm not looking for a nursing home, Derek. I'm just trying to help my daughter and spend time with my grandkids." That's when his face changed, when I saw something ugly flash across his eyes. He pushed off the counter and stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the bourbon on his breath, and he jabbed his finger into my chest, not hard enough to really hurt, but hard enough to make his point. "Let me make something real clear, Bob," he said, his voice dropping low and mean. "This is my house, my family, my rules, and I'm getting real tired of you acting like you have a say in anything that happens here." I didn't move, didn't flinch, just looked him straight in the eye, and that's when he did it. He shoved me, both hands on my shoulders, hard enough that I stumbled back against the sink. For a second, everything went quiet, and I could hear Sarah's footsteps upstairs, could hear the old furnace humming in the basement. And then Derek leaned in one more time and said, almost in a whisper, "Stay quiet, old man. You don't want to make this worse." I just nodded, turned around, and walked downstairs without saying a word. But here's what Derek didn't know, what he couldn't have known in that moment. Sarah had come back downstairs. She'd been standing in the hallway, just out of sight, and she'd seen the whole thing. The finger in my chest, the shove, the threat. When I glanced back from the basement stairs, I saw her standing there, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. And for just a second, I thought maybe she'd say something. Maybe she'd step in and tell her husband he'd crossed a line. But she didn't. She just stood there, frozen, and then she turned and walked back upstairs like nothing had happened. That's when I knew. This wasn't just about Derek anymore. This was about my own daughter choosing comfort over character, choosing to look the other way instead of standing up for what was right. And that, more than the shove, more than the words, that's what broke something inside me that I knew I'd never get back. That night, I went down to my basement room and I didn't sleep. Not right away, anyway. I sat on the edge of my bed, my shoulders still aching from where Derek had shoved me, and I stared at the wall for what felt like hours. Part of me wanted to march back upstairs, pack my things, and leave that house forever. Just walk away from the whole mess and let them figure it out on their own. But another part of me, the part that had spent 4 decades solving problems nobody else could solve, knew that walking away wasn't the answer. See, when you're dealing with a structure that's about to collapse, you don't just abandon the site and hope for the best. You assess the damage, you identify the weak points, and you figure out exactly what needs to happen to either save it or bring it down safely. And right then, sitting in that basement, I realized something important. Silence isn't the same as surrender. For the next few days, I didn't say a word about what happened. I didn't confront Derek, didn't pull Sarah aside for a heart-to-heart, didn't even change my routine. I got up every morning at 6, made my coffee, read the Post-Gazette at the kitchen table, and went about my day like nothing had changed. Derek avoided me at first, probably expecting me to blow up or move out. But when I didn't react, he got comfortable again, started acting like that night never happened, like he hadn't just physically threatened a man twice his age in his own kitchen. And Sarah? She tiptoed around both of us for a while. But eventually she fell back into her usual patterns too. Work, kids, pretending everything was fine. That's the thing about family betrayal. People want to forget it happened because remembering means they have to do something about it. And doing something is hard. But while they were forgetting, I was paying attention. I started noticing things I'd been too polite to really look at before. The stack of overdue bills that kept growing on Derek's desk in the den, the collection notices that came in the mail, the way he'd get tense and secretive whenever his phone rang during dinner. I saw him take cash out of Sarah's purse one morning when he thought nobody was looking. Just a couple 20s, nothing she'd miss right away, but it told me everything I needed to know. I heard him on the phone in the garage one afternoon, talking to someone about extending the terms and just another month, his voice tight with stress he never showed anyone else. And I remembered something one of my old supervisors used to say back when I was starting out. In construction, you don't stop a collapse by screaming at it. You wait, you watch, and you reinforce the right points at the right time. So that's what I did. I waited, and I watched, and I started making phone calls of my own. I called my old buddy Frank Delgado, who'd worked with me for 20 years before he retired and became a financial advisor over in Squirrel Hill. I asked him, real casual-like, what someone should look out for if they suspected a family member was in financial trouble. Frank gave me a list: credit card debt, car leases they can't afford, home equity loans, late payments, borrowing from retirement accounts. I thanked him, hung up, and started checking off boxes in my head. Derek hit every single one. Then I called my nephew Marcus, who's a lawyer specializing in family law and estate planning down in Harrisburg, and I asked him some hypothetical questions about financial abuse, about what happens when someone uses a family member's name or credit without permission. Marcus got real quiet and asked me if everything was okay, and I told him I was just curious, just trying to understand some things. The truth is, I wasn't planning some big dramatic revenge. That's not who I am, and that's not how I was raised. But I also wasn't going to just sit there and let Derek destroy my daughter's life, drain her savings, and teach my grandkids that bullying and lying is how real men behave. See, revenge stories like this aren't about getting even. They're about setting things right, about making sure the truth comes out before it's too late to fix anything. I'd spent my whole career making sure buildings could handle the weight they were designed to carry, and I knew how to spot a structure that was overloaded. That was one bad day away from catastrophic failure. Derek's whole life was built on debt and lies and borrowed time, and sooner or later, it was all going to come crashing down. The only question was whether I was going to let my daughter and grandkids get buried in the rubble, or whether I was going to do something about it. So when Derek came downstairs one evening in mid-October, about 2 weeks after he'd shoved me, and told me they were planning a family dinner that Saturday night, his parents were coming into town, he said, and it'd be nice if we could all just get along and act like adults. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I just looked him in the eye and said, "Sure, Derek. Sounds good. I'll be there." He looked almost surprised, like he'd expected me to push back, but then he just nodded and headed back upstairs. And as I listened to his footsteps fade, I felt something settle in my chest, something calm and clear and certain, because I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to set the table, just like he asked. I was going to smile and play nice, and I was going to make sure that dinner was one nobody in that house would ever forget. That Saturday morning, I woke up early, 5:30, same as always, and I drove my old Ford pickup down to the Giant Eagle on Center Avenue before the crowds showed up. I had a list in my head, not written down, just things I knew I needed to make this dinner exactly right. I walked those aisles slow and deliberate, picking out a nice ribeye roast from the butcher counter, fresh green beans, red potatoes, a good bottle of red wine, nothing crazy expensive, but nicer than what we usually had around the house. The young guy at the checkout couldn't have been more than 20. He looked at my cart and said, "Somebody's got a special occasion tonight," and I just smiled and said, "Yeah, something like that." I loaded everything into the truck, and on the drive back to Fox Chapel, I felt this strange kind of calm settle over me. The same feeling I used to get right before a big project went live. That moment when all the planning's done and now it's just time to execute. Back at the house, Sarah was upstairs getting the kids ready for some birthday party they had that afternoon. And Derek was still asleep. He'd been out late the night before, probably at a bar somewhere, spending money he didn't have. I unpacked the groceries quiet-like, started prepping everything in the kitchen, and I let my mind wander back to all the Saturday dinners Helen and I used to host back on Walnut Street. She'd make her famous pot roast. I'd set the table with the good china we got as a wedding gift, and we'd have friends and family over, laughing and telling stories until midnight. Those were good days, simple days, back when family meant something more than just tolerating each other under the same roof. I thought about Helen a lot that morning, wondered what she'd think of all this, wondered if she'd tell me I was doing the right thing, or if she'd say I was being stubborn and prideful. But deep down, I knew. She'd have wanted me to protect Sarah and those kids, no matter what it cost me. Around noon, Derek finally came downstairs, poured himself coffee, and saw me working in the kitchen. "You cooking tonight, Bob?" he asked, and there was this edge in his voice, like he was surprised I'd actually go through with it after everything. I just nodded, kept chopping potatoes, and said, "Yeah, figured I'd help out. It's a family dinner, right?" He stood there for a second, watching me, and I could tell he was trying to figure out if I was being sincere or if I had something up my sleeve. But I didn't give him anything to work with, just kept my face neutral, my tone friendly, my hands busy. Finally, he shrugged and said, "Well, my parents are getting here around 6, so make sure everything's ready." And then he walked off. That's the thing about guys like Derek. They're so used to people doing what they're told that they never stop to wonder why someone's suddenly being so cooperative. The afternoon passed slow and steady, and I worked in that kitchen like I was back on a job site, every step planned, every detail checked twice, every piece falling into place exactly when and where it needed to. I seasoned the roast, got it in the oven at the right temp, blanched the green beans, set the potatoes to boil. I pulled out the good dishes from the cabinet, the ones Sarah and Derek only used for holidays, and I set that dining room table like it was Thanksgiving. Cloth napkins folded neat, wine glasses polished, candles in the middle. Sarah came down around 4, saw what I'd done, and she got this look on her face, something between gratitude and guilt, like she knew she should have been helping, but also knew she'd been avoiding me since that night Derek shoved me. "Dad, you didn't have to do all this," she said quietly, and I just smiled and said, "I know, sweetheart, I wanted to." She didn't say anything else, just squeezed my shoulder and went back upstairs. While the roast was finishing, I stepped out onto the back deck, the one I'd rebuilt with my own hands, and I made a phone call. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "Marcus, it's Uncle Bob," I said. "You still planning on stopping by tonight?" There was a pause, and then my nephew's voice came through, careful and concerned. "Yeah, I'll be there around 6:30, just like you asked." "Uncle Bob, are you sure about this? You sounded pretty serious when we talked last week." I looked out at the yard, at the swing set I'd built for Emma and Jake, at the fence I'd repaired, at all the pieces of this life I'd tried so hard to be part of, and I said, "Yeah, Marcus, I'm sure. It's time." We talked for another minute, confirmed the details, and then I hung up. When I turned around, I saw Derek standing in the doorway, watching me through the glass. Our eyes met for just a second, and I saw something flicker across his face. Suspicion, maybe, or worry. But then I smiled and held up my phone like I'd just been checking the weather, and he turned and walked away. By 5:30, everything was ready. The roast was resting on the counter. The sides were warm and waiting. The table looked like something out of a magazine. I went downstairs, took a shower, put on a clean button-down shirt and the nice slacks I usually saved for church, and I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. I thought about all the years I'd spent building things, fixing things, holding things together, and I thought about how sometimes the hardest part of construction isn't putting something up. It's knowing when a structure's too far gone, when the only responsible thing to do is a controlled demolition. I thought about Derek upstairs, cocky and clueless, thinking he'd won, thinking he'd put the old man in his place. And I thought about what was about to happen in the next few hours, about the truth that was finally going to come out. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not bitterness, just a quiet, steady sense of purpose. Tonight wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. And there's a big difference between the two. Derek's parents showed up right at 6. Bill and Patricia, nice enough folks from Butler who never really understood what their son had become. We all sat down at that table I'd set so carefully. And for the first 20 minutes, everything was polite and surface level. Compliments on the food, small talk about the weather, Derek bragging about some sale he'd closed last week. I sat at the far end, quiet, just nodding and smiling, playing my part. Sarah kept glancing at me with this nervous energy, like she was waiting for me to say something or do something, but I just ate my food and poured wine and acted like everything was perfectly normal. Derek, meanwhile, was in his element, holding court, telling stories, laughing loud, completely confident that he'd won, that the old man had been put in his place and learned to stay quiet. He even raised his glass at one point and said, "Here's to family," and everyone clinked glasses, and I looked him dead in the eye and smiled. Then, at 6:28, I remember looking at the clock on the wall. The doorbell rang. Everyone stopped mid-conversation, forks hovering over plates, because nobody was expecting anyone else. Sarah looked confused. Patricia looked curious. And Derek, I watched his face change in real time. The color drained right out of it. His jaw tightened, and his hand gripped his wine glass so hard I thought it might shatter. "Who's that?" Sarah asked, looking at Derek, then at me. I set down my napkin, stood up slow, and said, "That'd be my nephew Marcus. I invited him. Hope that's okay." The room went dead silent. Derek's eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time since I'd moved into that house, I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Fear. Real, genuine, gut-level fear. Because he knew. Somehow, in that split second, he knew this wasn't just a family dinner anymore. I walked to the front door and opened it, and there stood Marcus, 34 years old, sharp suit, leather briefcase, every inch the successful attorney he'd become. "Uncle Bob," he said, giving me a hug, and then he looked past me into the dining room and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Sorry I'm late. Traffic coming up from Harrisburg was brutal." I led him into the dining room, introduced him around. Bill and Patricia remembered him from a wedding years back. Sarah gave him a confused hug, and Derek just sat there, frozen, staring. "Marcus, you remember my son-in-law Derek, right?" I said, my voice friendly, casual. Marcus extended his hand for a shake, and Derek took it like he was shaking hands with the Grim Reaper. "Yeah, good to see you again, Derek," Marcus said. And then he set his briefcase down on the empty chair next to him, and I swear you could have heard a pin drop in that room. "So, Marcus," I said, sitting back down and cutting into my roast like nothing unusual was happening. "You said you had those documents I asked about." Marcus nodded, clicked open his briefcase, and pulled out a manila folder. Thick, official looking, the kind that means somebody's in serious trouble. "Yeah, Uncle Bob, I've got everything right here. Took a little digging, but it's all documented." Derek's fork clattered onto his plate. "What documents?" Sarah asked, her voice small and confused, looking between me and Marcus and her husband. I took a sip of wine, set the glass down gentle, and said, "Well, sweetheart, about 3 weeks ago, I started noticing some things that didn't add up. Bills piling up, collection calls, your husband acting real secretive about money. So I asked Marcus to do some checking, just to make sure everything was on the up and up." Patricia leaned forward, concerned. Bill's face got serious. And Derek? Derek looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. Marcus pulled out the first document, slid it across the table towards Sarah, and said in that calm, professional lawyer voice, "Sarah, Did you know that your husband took out a second mortgage on this house 8 months ago without telling you?" Her face went white. "What?" she whispered. Marcus pulled out another paper. Did you know he's got $17,000 in credit card debt across 4 different cards, all of them maxed out?" Another paper. "Did you know he borrowed $32,000 from his company's retirement account and hasn't made a single payment back?" With every document Marcus laid out, I watched my daughter's world crumble, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because she needed to see the truth, needed to understand what I'd been trying to tell her for months. And Derek? He tried to bluster at first, started saying things like, "This is private," and "You had no right," but Marcus just kept going, calm and methodical, laying out every lie, every hidden debt, every reckless decision. Then Marcus pulled out one more paper, the one I'd asked him to find, and he slid it directly to me. "And Bob," Marcus said, looking right at me with something like anger and respect mixed together, "did you know that Derek used your name and social security number to co-sign a loan for $48,000 back in February?" The room exploded. Sarah gasped. Bill stood up. Patricia put her hand over her mouth, and I just sat there, holding that paper, looking at Derek across the table. "That's identity theft," Marcus said quietly. "That's fraud." "That's a felony!" Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, and then he turned to me, his voice desperate, and said, "Bob, I can explain. I was going to tell you. I just needed—" But I held up my hand, and he stopped. I folded that paper, put it in my pocket, and I said, in the calmest voice I've ever used, "Derek, I stayed quiet when you disrespected me. I stayed quiet when you shoved me in this kitchen 2 weeks ago. I stayed quiet because I thought maybe you'd figure things out. Maybe you'd be man enough to fix your mistakes. But you didn't. You just kept digging, kept lying, kept using my family, my daughter, my name, my grandkids' future to cover up your own failures. So, no, I'm not staying quiet anymore. This isn't revenge, son. This is just the truth finally coming out. And the truth is, you built your whole life on a foundation of lies, and now it's all coming down." The silence that followed was the kind that crushes you, thick and heavy, like the air right before a thunderstorm breaks. Sarah just sat there staring at those documents spread across the table, her hands shaking, tears starting to roll down her cheeks, and I could see the exact moment it all clicked for her. Every time I'd tried to warn her, every concerned conversation she'd brushed off, every red flag she'd ignored because it was easier to believe her husband than to face the truth. She looked up at Derek, and her voice came out broken and small. "You used my father's name. You stole from him." Derek tried to reach for her hand, started stammering excuses about cash flow and temporary setbacks and how he was going to fix everything, but she pulled away like he'd burned her. And then she turned to me, and the look on her face. God, that look. It wasn't just shock or anger. It was shame, deep and crushing. Because she knew she'd chosen comfort over character, knew she'd stood in that hallway and watched him shove me and done absolutely nothing. "Dad, she started, but her voice cracked, and she couldn't finish. Patricia was crying now too, and Bill had his hand on Derek's shoulder, not in support, but in that way you hold someone when you're trying to keep them from running. Marcus quietly gathered up the documents, put them back in his briefcase, and said, "Derek, I need to be clear about something. Bob could press charges right now. Identity theft, fraud, forgery. You're looking at serious prison time. But he asked me to come here tonight to give you one chance to make this right." Derek's head snapped up, a flicker of desperate hope crossing his face. And Marcus continued, "You've got 72 hours to contact every creditor, every bank, every institution where you used Bob's information, and you're going to remove his name from everything. You're going to take full responsibility for every cent of that debt. And you're going to do it all with documentation that Bob and I can verify." Derek opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but Bill cut him off. "You'll do exactly what he says, Derek. Every word." The disappointment in that father's voice was devastating. You could hear 40 years of failed expectations and broken promises all coming due at once. Then Marcus pulled out one more document, slid it across to Sarah, and said gently, "Sarah, this is a separation of assets agreement. Your dad had me draw it up just in case. It protects you and the kids from Derek's debt, makes sure the house stays in your name only, and establishes clear financial boundaries going forward." She took the paper with trembling hands, and I watched her read through it, watched her realize that while her husband had been destroying their future, her father had been quietly protecting it. That's when she really broke, put her face in her hands and sobbed, not pretty crying, but the kind that comes from somewhere deep and painful, the kind that happens when you finally see how badly you've been betrayed by someone you trusted completely. Derek stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loud against the floor. And for a second, I thought he might try to run or fight or do something stupid. But he just stood there, swaying slightly, looking around the table at his parents, disappointed faces, at his wife's tears, at Marcus's briefcase full of evidence, and at me, the old man he'd shoved and threatened and dismissed as irrelevant. "You set me up," he said, his voice hollow. I stood up too, looked him right in the eye, and said, "No, Derek, you set yourself up. I just made sure everyone could see the foundation you built your life on, and it turns out it was nothing but debt and lies and borrowed time. I spent 43 years making sure structures didn't collapse and kill people. What you built? It was already falling. I just made sure my daughter and grandkids didn't get buried in the rubble when it came down." He didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. Within 20 minutes, Derek had packed a bag and left for his parents' place in Butler. The house felt different after he was gone, quieter, but also lighter, like something toxic had finally been removed. The next few weeks were hard on Sarah, harder than I'd wanted them to be, but necessary. She filed for separation, started going to therapy, began the long process of untangling her finances from Derek's mess. Marcus worked with her to make sure Derek followed through on removing my name from everything, and to his credit, or maybe just his fear, Derek did it all, documented every step. I stayed in that basement room, but things were different now. Sarah talked to me again, really talked, asked my advice, listened when I spoke. Emma and Jake didn't understand all the details, but they knew their dad had done something wrong, and Grandpa Bob had helped keep them safe. And me. I didn't feel victorious or triumphant. I just felt tired and sad and grateful that I'd spoken up before it was too late. See, this wasn't about revenge stories where the bad guy gets destroyed and everyone cheers. This was about family betrayal and what you do when the people you love make choices that hurt everyone around them. Sometimes justice isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just making sure the truth comes out, making sure the people you love are protected, and making sure you don't stay quiet when staying quiet means watching everything fall apart. So here's what I learned through all of this, and maybe it'll help somebody out there who's going through something similar. Silence isn't weakness, but knowing when to stop being silent, that's wisdom. For too long, I thought keeping the peace meant swallowing my pride, meant letting people walk all over me just to avoid conflict. But that's not peace. That's surrender. Real peace comes when you stand up for what's right, when you protect the people you love, even when it costs you something. I didn't raise my voice that night. I didn't throw punches or make threats. I just raised the standard, showed my daughter and my grandkids that you don't have to be loud to be strong, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let lies win. If you've ever been told to stay quiet to keep the peace, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I want you to know your voice matters, your truth matters, and there's a right time to use it. So, if this story hit home for you, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment below telling me, have you ever been told to stay quiet to keep the peace? I read every single one, and I'd love to hear your story. Thanks for staying with me till the end.